You were 12 years old and the house was dark, and the only light in your bedroom was the orange glow behind the metal grille of a Hallicrafters S38 that sat on the desk your father built you from 2x4s and a piece of plywood. You turned the big black dial 1 degree at a time, and somewhere between the static and the silence, a man's voice came through speaking a language you had never heard, and you held your breath, because for the first time in your life, the world was talking directly to you. Before we dive in, hit subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. That radio cost $49.95. Your father ordered it from Sears or Montgomery Ward, or maybe from the Allied radio catalog that came in the mail every spring. And when it arrived in that brown box with Hallicrafters stamped on the side in silver letters, you carried it to your room like it was something holy. You peeled back the cardboard, and there it was, gray metal with a black crinkle finish and 5 knobs and a dial that stretched from 540 kilocycles all the way to 32 megacycles across 4 bands. And when you plugged it in for the first time, you could smell the tubes warming up. A warm electrical sweetness that mixed with the dust on the chassis and became a scent that you never forgot and never will. You sat there that first night and turned the band switch to shortwave, and the dial lit up with numbers that meant nothing to you yet, but would mean everything within a year. And the first voice you pulled in was the BBC World Service coming from London, England, 3,500 miles from your bedroom in Ohio or Indiana or Michigan, and you thought to yourself, this changes everything. It changed everything because Hallicrafters was not just a radio, it was a window. A window you could open from a bedroom in any town in America and hear Moscow and Havana and Tokyo and Cairo and the voice of America bouncing off the ionosphere at night when the skip was good and the whole shortwave spectrum lit up like a carnival. You kept a spiral notebook next to the radio and you wrote down every station you heard, the frequency, the time, the call letters if you could catch them, and by the end of your first month, that notebook had entries from 14 different countries and you had never left your zip code. You learned to read a propagation chart before you learned to drive a car. You knew that the 25-meter band opened up after sunset and that 49 meters was best at midnight, and that if you stayed up past 2 in the morning on a clear winter night with the antenna aimed east, you could hear Radio Australia coming through like it was next door. Your mother did not understand what you were doing up there at midnight with your ear pressed to that speaker. She thought you were wasting time. Your father understood completely because he was the one who bought it for you, and maybe he had dreamed of it himself when he was your age, but never had the money, and now he did, and the look on your face the night you brought in Radio Switzerland, the music box interval signal chiming through the static, clear as a church bell from 6,000 miles away, was worth every one of those $49.95. Some boys had baseball cards on their walls. You had a world map on yours with pins in every city you had heard, and by the time you were 14, there were 47 pins in that map, and you knew more about international broadcasting than most adults knew about their own neighborhoods. The man who made that possible was William J. Halligan, and he understood that feeling better than anyone alive because he had lived it himself. Bill Halligan was born in Boston in 1898 to an Irish-American family, and by the time he was 16 years old, he was already a licensed professional wireless operator, tapping out Morse code on equipment he had built with his own hands in an era when radio was still magic, and the men who operated it were treated like magicians. He worked the wireless on ships and at shore stations, and he fell so deeply in love with radio that he never considered doing anything else with his life. He moved to Chicago in 1928 and started selling radio parts. On the first day of January 1933, in the absolute dead center of the Great Depression, he did something that most people would call insane. He started a radio manufacturing company. He named it Hallicrafters, a combination of his own name and the word handcrafters, because that is exactly what he intended to do. He would build shortwave receivers by hand with a precision that no one else in the business could match. He had almost nothing. His entire inventory fit on 2 trucks. His workshop was a rented room. And within weeks of opening his doors, the Radio Corporation of America, the most powerful electronics company on the planet, filed a patent lawsuit against him because he was building super heterodyne receivers without an RCA license, which in 1933 was like opening a gas station without permission from Standard Oil. RCA could have ended him right there. They had ended other companies for less. But Bill Halligan did something brilliant. He heard that a company called Silver Marshall had just gone bankrupt, and the most valuable thing in that bankrupt estate was not a factory or a warehouse or a list of customers. It was an RCA patent license. Halligan bought the entire bankrupt company for almost nothing just to get that piece of paper, and with that single move, he turned a legal catastrophe into a legitimate business overnight. That was the kind of man he was. He did not back down, and he did not give up, and he did not waste time feeling sorry for himself because there was a radio to build, and the world was waiting to hear it. By 1938, Hallicrafters was selling receivers in 89 countries and had become one of the most respected names in shortwave radio anywhere on Earth. The Super Skyrider SX-28 was already becoming a legend among serious listeners and ham operators, a receiver so well built that its audio quality made expensive home radios sound like toys. When you turned on an SX-28, you heard things in the signal that other radios missed entirely, and that reputation for precision and clarity was what made Hallicrafters different from every other manufacturer in Chicago. There were plenty of them: Zenith, Motorola, Admiral, and a dozen others, all fighting for the same customers on the same streets. Then the war came and everything changed. Hallicrafters suspended all civilian production and converted entirely to military manufacturing. Between Pearl Harbor and the end of the war, they produced more than $44 million worth of radio equipment for the Army and Navy and for Lend-Lease, which was an almost unthinkable amount for a company that had been doing $2 million a year before the war started. The SCR-299 mobile communication system, built around adapted Hallicrafters transmitters and receivers, rolled across Europe and the Pacific in the back of military trucks and became one of the most critical pieces of communications equipment in the Allied arsenal. The United States government awarded Hallicrafters the Army and Navy E Award for Excellence in Wartime Production, and Bill Halligan's name went from being known by radio hobbyists to being known by generals and defense planners in Washington. He was 45 years old, and he had built his company from a rented room into one of the most important electronics manufacturers in the country, and he had done it in 12 years. After the war, the boom began, and it lasted almost 20 years, and those were the years that matter most to you, because those were the years when Hallicrafters became the radio on your desk. The S-38, originally introduced in 1946, became the most important shortwave receiver in American history, not because it was the best, but because it was the one you could afford. At $49.95, it was the gateway, the entry point, the first real communications receiver a boy could own without needing his father to take out a loan. Sears sold it in their catalog. Montgomery Ward sold it in theirs. Allied Radio stocked it on their shelves in Chicago. It had 5 tubes and a simple circuit, and if you knew what you were doing, you could hear stations from every continent on Earth from your bedroom. Millions of American boys knew what they were doing because their fathers had shown them, or their older brothers had shown them, or they had figured it out themselves from the diagrams in Popular Electronics magazine. Once you had the S-38, you wanted more because that is how it works. And that is how it has always worked with boys and radios and the promise of hearing something you have never heard before. The next step was the SX99, the receiver with the S meter that told you exactly how strong the signal was, the crystal filter that let you cut through interference, and the 8 tubes that made everything sound fuller and richer and more alive than anything the S-38 could produce. The SX99 cost more than you could save in a summer, but not more than you could save in a year if you mowed every lawn on the block, shoveled every driveway in January, and did not spend a single dollar on anything else. When you finally had enough and your father drove you to the store and you walked out carrying that box, you felt something that no amount of money could buy later in life. The pride of having earned something real with your own hands and your own time and your own patience. Some of those boys became engineers because of a Hallicrafters radio. Some became physicists. Some joined the Navy and operated communication systems on destroyers and aircraft carriers because they already knew how radio waves worked before they signed their enlistment papers. Some got their amateur radio licenses at 15 and are still on the air today at 75, 80, and 85, still tuning, still listening, still chasing that feeling of a signal rising out of the noise at midnight. The number of American careers that started with a Hallicrafters S-38 on a plywood desk in a boy's bedroom is not something that can be counted, but it is something that can be felt by everyone who was part of it. And in 1950, something remarkable happened. Raymond Loewy, the most famous industrial designer in America, the man who had designed the Studebaker Starliner, the interior of Air Force One, the Lucky Strike cigarette package, and the Shell Oil logo, personally redesigned the S-38. He gave it a cleaner face and a more modern look. And when you realize that the same man who shaped what the President of the United States saw when he boarded his airplane also shaped what you saw when you sat down at your desk at midnight to listen to the world, you begin to understand how seriously Hallicrafters took what they were building. This was not a toy. This was not a hobby gadget. This was a precision instrument that happened to be priced for a 12-year-old's savings account. By 1952, Hallicrafters occupied a factory complex in Chicago that stretched an entire city block. A 3-story building 2 blocks away handled overflow. A coil plant on the north side wound the transformers. Storage and production facilities filled 5 separate buildings within a 5-mile radius. 2,500 men and women came to work every morning, and they built receivers, transmitters, and test equipment by hand. Every single one of them knew that the name on the front panel meant something. It meant that when a boy in Dayton, Ohio plugged in his S-38 and tuned the dial to the 25-meter band at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night and heard a carrier wave build out of the noise, the voice that came through would be clear, the tuning would be smooth, and the receiver would do exactly what Bill Halligan had promised 40 years earlier when he first scratched the name Hallicrafters on a piece of paper in a rented room. But by the early 1960s, something was happening that Bill Halligan could see but could not stop. Japanese electronics companies were producing receivers and transmitters that were smaller, lighter, cheaper, and in some cases better than anything coming out of Chicago. The American consumer electronics industry was beginning to collapse under the weight of competition that played by different rules, paid different wages, and had the backing of a government that saw electronics exports as a national strategy. It was not just Hallicrafters. It was the entire American way of building things with human hands and American wages in American factories. The same hands that wound those coils, soldered those connections, and tested those receivers before they went into boxes with Hallicrafters stamped on the side were now too expensive to keep employed. When a factory in Osaka could do the same work for a fraction of the cost and ship it across the Pacific for less than it cost to truck it across Illinois. One by one, the American names started disappearing. Motorola sold its television business to Matsushita. RCA, the company that had sued Hallicrafters out of existence in 1933 and lost, sold its entire consumer electronics division to Thomson of France. Admiral was swallowed by Rockwell, and Hallicrafters, the company that had built radios for the Army and Navy and for every boy in America who ever pressed his ear to a speaker at midnight, was running out of room to breathe. In 1966, Bill Halligan made the decision that he later described as the hardest of his life. He sold Hallicrafters to the Northrop Corporation, a defense contractor headquartered in Los Angeles. The purchase price was never publicly disclosed. What was disclosed was what Northrop intended to do with the company, which was to stop making ham radios and shortwave receivers and start making electronic countermeasure systems and paramilitary communications equipment. The factory was moved from Chicago to Rolling Meadows, a suburb 30 miles northwest. The Halligan family was out. Bill Halligan was 68 years old, and the company that carried his name and his philosophy and his stubborn belief that a radio should be built like a surgical instrument was now owned by people who had never heard a shortwave station fade in from across the ocean at 2 o'clock in the morning. They made a few more ham radios through 1972. A few accessories trickled out through 1974, and then the line went silent. The last Hallicrafters receiver rolled off the production line, and there was no announcement, no ceremony, and no newspaper headline. One day, they were still building radios in a suburb of Chicago, and the next day, they were not. The building that used to say Hallicrafters on the wall now said Northrop Corporation Defense Systems Division. The men and women who had wound coils and soldered connections on receivers that would end up on the desks of 12-year-old boys in Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan were now winding coils and soldering connections on equipment that would end up in places those 12-year-old boys would never see and never hear about. In 1975, Northrop sold the Hallicrafters name, but kept the factory, which is a sentence that tells you everything you need to know about what the name had become. It was a line item on a balance sheet, a trademark without a product, a word on a piece of paper that used to mean precision and clarity, and a boy's first real connection to the world beyond his town. By 1988, the remaining assets and the rights to the name Hallicrafters were held by court-appointed trustees, which is a polite way of saying that the company that once stretched a city block in Chicago and sold receivers in 89 countries and helped win a world war had been reduced to a file in a law office. Bill Halligan retired to Florida. He stayed active in amateur radio until the end, because that is who he was and that is who he had always been, the 16-year-old kid from Boston who heard a signal come through the static and decided that nothing else in the world mattered as much as that sound. He died on July 14, 1992 in Miami Beach. He was 93 years old. His call sign was W9AC, and there are men listening right now who remember hearing him on the air. If you are one of those men, you know exactly what his signal sounded like, because a Hallicrafters man always ran clean audio. If you still have one in your basement, go down there tonight, plug it in, wait for the tubes to warm up. It will take about 30 seconds, and you will smell that smell again. The warm dust and ozone, hot glass, and old solder that has not changed in 60 years. Turn the band switch to shortwave, turn the dial. Somewhere between the static and the silence, there will be a carrier wave building out of the noise, and a voice will come through speaking a language you do not understand from a city you have never visited. For one moment, you will be 12 years old again, lying on your stomach on the floor of your bedroom with the lights off, the whole world coming through a speaker the size of your fist. You will remember that the man who made that possible started with nothing but 2 trucks worth of parts, a dream, and a name that meant exactly what it said. Halligan, handcrafters, Hallicrafters, the radio every boy heard the world on. And the world has been a little quieter since the day they stopped making them. If this brought back a memory, tell us about it. What was your first Hallicrafters? What was the first station you pulled in? We would love to hear your story.